Hi, everybody. This is going to be our last Next Comes What for 2025. I hope you all are having or have already had some happy holidays and that we all might get a wonderful start to 2026.
Who could this be? Hello! It's the mayor!
Thanks to each one of you for being a part of this podcast, reaching hundreds of thousands of people in its first year.
I want to do the Shehecheyanu because that's about new beginnings. Yes. And this is a new beginning.
Thank you also to Jason Sattler for all his work producing each episode.
Thank you so much.
And a special thank you to those of you who are paid subscribers to my newsletter, Degenerate Art. That newsletter is the basis for this podcast, and if you would like to support it, you can find out how to sign up on the homepage of my website, AndreaPitzer.com. On to the podcast. So much is being done to foster and manipulate hatred in the United States right now.
Ladies and gentlemen, they are not sending their best.
It can honestly be hard to keep up with.
Omar Fateh was Ilhan Omar's candidate for mayor of Mogadishu. Minneapolis.
But I am going to talk about the way that propaganda creates social shifts, because the implications are huge and they're underway right now.
The Democrats don't care about anything other than maybe transing their kids.
Last week at the Hoover Building in Washington, D.C., Secretary of Health and Human Services, Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
Current evidence does not support claims that puberty blockers, raw sex hormones, and surgeries are safe and effective.
Headed up announcements banning hospitals participating in Medicare and Medicaid, which is nearly all hospitals.
Puberty blockers are prescribed to children all of the time.
Banning them from providing gender-affirming medical care to trans minors.
It is not just trans kids, which is why the Supreme Court ruling and all of the laws that have passed that seek to ban gender-affirming care specifically mention that they are banning puberty blockers if they are being used to treat gender dysphoria.
Meanwhile, the U.S. House of Representatives passed a bill that criminalizes the provision of gender-affirming medical care for any transgender person under 18.
I spend a lot of time in LGBTQ clubs in high schools talking to young people who are shocked when I come in and tell them that as a queer woman, I'm a member of Congress. And they say, do you know any trans people your age?
It should be noted that this bill is unlikely to make it through the Senate.
Because they don't believe that they will make it to 40. They don't believe that they will make it to 50 or 60. They don't believe that they have a future because they listen to the words that come out of our mouths and they know that half of the people in this chamber do not care if they survive.
But even on the state level, we're seeing more and more extreme proposals and ridiculous actions, as with Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton.
Angela Paxton filed for divorce on biblical grounds following, quote, recent discoveries. She does not believe that her marriage honors God.
Creating a tip line for those who believe that trans women have been allowed to use a woman's bathroom.
We're seeing it all across Texas where people are just being blatantly discriminated, profiled, and it is something that is a choice that is now going to have to weigh on me every time I make it.
These attitudes lead to humiliating enforcement measures, as when the Texas Department of Public Safety officers were photographed guarding the women's bathroom.
Civil rights attorney Austin Kaplan said this may encourage illegal behavior. He said there are 3 areas of the Texas Penal Code that outlaw taking pictures of someone in a bathroom.
That's going to potentially lead to criminal liability for people that do that.
So today I want to talk about how institutional power holders are ginning up hatred against trans people for political gain, how that parallels other movements in the U.S. and abroad,
Little Freudian slip there.
and why the more deeply that propaganda gets entrenched, the harder it becomes to do anything about it, or even to have a reality-based conversation about any particular group that's been the focus of long-term propaganda. I've spoken before about transphobia in the UK and how left-leaning women and self-identified feminists bought into this wave of hate that has inexplicably turned into almost a full-time job for J.K. Rowling, accusing trans people of everything from molesting children to turning lesbians extinct.
Because, and let me just check my notes for a second, they claim it's deeply uncool, is so uncommon, and is now bottom of the heap to be a lesbian. The heap of what? I'm not sure.
And it was all laundered through major newspapers, with several female editors attacking the existence of trans people in public life or allowing their reporters to.
Christine Burns, editor of Trans Britain. Why is the UK so hostile to trans people?
It's a mystery to all of us.
The situation got bad enough in November 2018 that the U.S. Guardian wrote a public response to the UK Guardian staff over an editorial they had written.
It wasn't widespread until extremely recently. As late as 2017, we'd made steady advances for trans people in Britain with legislation that protected our employment rights, our right to be served in shops and use other services, and of course the Gender Recognition Act, which I was part of bringing forwards in 2004.
It's an important point to note that as late as September 2020, the UK government published results of a public consultation that showed wide support for all aspects of reforming how the public and the government interacts with trans people. 64% were in favor of ending an existing requirement that those who wanted to legally change their gender had to have a medical diagnosis of gender dysphoria. And 80% were in favor of removing the requirement for a medical report to go with that. However, despite those results from the public consultation, the UK government decided not to change its current law.
I would blame that directly on our media.
And now, 5 years later, in a poll from February, the kind of damage that results from years of propaganda became clear.
We changed the law many times to make life safer for trans people over a period of about 15 years. And most people didn't even notice we were there because we don't impinge on people's lives.
There is now just a 1 percentage point difference between those who believe that trans folks should be able to change both their public and their legal gender, and those who believe they should be able to change neither.
It wasn't until about 2017 that a confected campaign was launched with certain of Britain's newspapers, and newspapers in particular, making a big issue that suddenly we went to having, with some newspapers, 3 or 4 articles, very negative articles.
Yeah, I'm reading some of the headlines
a week.
It's a tremendous and devastating loss of support for trans people in the UK.
They figured if they were going to tackle the success of lesbian, gay, bisexual and trans people, then they should begin by trying to chip one of those letters off the block.
So what happens to make these kinds of changes?
Kennedy shared a theory a while ago that man-made chemicals in the environment are making children gay or transgender and causing the feminization of boys and masculinization of girls.
Today's poisoned rhetoric most copies that used against gay and lesbian folks in prior decades.
Chances are someone you know is a homosexual, even though you may not be aware of it.
It's the same just asking questions approach that serves to actively undermine any comprehension of what's really taking place and what public policies would be ideal.
These chemicals that we are just raining down on our children right now to induce these very profound sexual changes in them.
Until a group is sufficiently demonized, some kind of mythology has to be spun up.
Alex Jones went viral for making similar comments a few years ago. He said they were putting chemicals in the water that were turning the frogs gay. Now, the experts that we talked to about this, they basically said, you're comparing apples to oranges here. We're humans, frogs are amphibians. With humans, our sex is determined at the moment of conceptions. Frogs' sex is determined by a number of environmental factors.
In the case of trans people, They had fought for decades and slowly made institutional progress toward trans rights and respect. Doctors and hospitals had been working out treatment plans. Pediatricians had consulted with researchers to determine best practices. Legal frameworks were evolving.
Repeat after me. I, Jim O'Neill.
I, Jim O'Neill.
I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States.
That I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States.
Jim is a critical piece in assuring the success of this agency over the next 4 years.
But demonization requires that kind of slow deliberation and careful determination to be disregarded entirely.
The blurring of the lines between sexes and radical social agendas is a hatred for nature as God designed it.
Political players who seek to use a targeted group for political gain first have to pretend that none of that careful deliberation ever happened.
The American Medical Association, the American Academy of Pediatrics, peddled the lie that chemical and surgical sex-rejecting procedures could be good for children who suffer from gender dysphoria.
They have to present the rights of the targeted group as happening and expanding secretly, quickly, and dishonestly.
Men are men. Men can never become women. Women are women. Women can never become men.
Often the first thing that goes is the stripping of autonomy from people.
Children are innocent, and they need our protection.
The language of protection is often a first path to doing this. We are protecting this vulnerable group from that aggressive population. This is the framework you see in the UK, that women's rights are threatened by recognizing trans women as women and giving them similar rights.
I would characterize this as a bit like people wrapping themselves in the trappings of Christian religion in order to practice white supremacy or whatever other line they want to take. I don't think the people we're talking about really are feminists.
Sometimes these political actors will be claiming to protect the targeted, undesirable group itself.
What does this do to sexual development in children?
This is the model in the U.S., where for now the government and too many media outlets pretend to be protecting trans children.
Nobody knows, because we know what it does to frogs.
This is also parallel to the language of "we are protecting Jews."
Joining us now is Peter Beinart, an editor-at-large at Jewish Currents. He is the author of Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza, A Reckoning.
In the Trump administration's attempt to suppress free speech.
On the one hand, the Trump administration is boasting that Northwestern is going to treat all students equally, irrespective of race, religion, national origin, etc. And then literally in the next sentence it says, and it's also going to do this special thing to protect Jewish students.
Even if the people they're silencing turn out themselves to be Jewish.
This is, in a way, a kind of importing of the Israeli model of what makes Jews safe, as opposed to the traditional American model, which comes out of the American Jewish role in the civil rights movement, which argues that the safety of American Jews comes from arguing for equality under the law and fighting against bigotry for all groups.
Perhaps most monstrous is this public pretense that the Trump administration has any interest in protecting children whatsoever.
We have Jess Michaels, an Epstein survivor, and now an advocate for transparency and accountability.
While the man in the White House desperately tries to cover up his involvement with the most notorious pedophile of our century.
Ghislaine Maxwell's had more communication with this DOJ than any of us have had.
When I was writing my first book, The Secret History of Vladimir Nabokov,
in vain would Nabokov describe how his nymphette was one of the most innocent and pure among the gallery of slaves he had created as characters. To no avail would Vera remind reporters of how a captive Lolita cried herself to sleep each night.
One of the things that it was really difficult to get across, and this was just 13 years ago, was the degree to which Cold War propaganda and paranoia made any concrete discussion of how to deal with the Soviet Union almost impossible.
They're making it laws where you can't drink when you want to. You have to wear a seatbelt when you're driving. And pretty soon we're going to be a communist country.
There were foaming at the mouth types who were sure that anyone who wanted civil rights for black people or women was a communist about to open fire on the streets.
Now turning to the White House, where a 73-year-old legal statute is being used to defend the Trump administration's immigration crackdown. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952 was passed amid anti-communist fears during the early Cold War.
There were cynical politicians who were using fear to garner more power.
Author and reporter Clay Ryson joins to discuss what past political hysteria tells us about the present.
It might sound similar to today.
One of the things that is important to keep in mind when we think back from our present moment or maybe recent past is how fragile civil liberties are and how willing people are to trade some civil liberties for the promise of security.
But it was actually different.
Part of that message coming from President Truman and from Congress was that this war has to be fought domestically as well, that we have an obligation to be 100% security-minded.
The Cold War binary tended to split everything into teams, like we see today.
It was a period of rampant, sort of unchecked anti-communist hysteria.
But the Soviets were actually doing a lot of bad stuff. And that needed to be addressed.
There was a real reason for it. Look, there was Soviet espionage in the United States. There was the Cold War, obviously.
Yet the hysteria around that government was such that how to form actual policy became incredibly loaded. Almost too loaded for any rational discussion.
But it got out of hand in a pretty dangerous way and scary way, where even teachers and postal workers were being called into question for their loyalty to America.
Trans kids and adults, however, are not actually endangering anyone.
I just finished watching The Matrix with my then 16-year-old, and I was sitting patiently on the couch, listening as she courageously began to find her voice and tell me that she is transgender.
The greatest possible harm out of all this will be to their ability to live their own lives and access medical care.
What would you do if you were in my place? I was an ordained pastor, and an evangelical one at that.
And that is what RFK Jr. and his henchmen went after so radically last week.
A few days later, I was still processing all of this, and I can remember asking my daughter a question that I now see as insensitive, but I asked her, so do you think that you were born transgender, or did something happen that caused you to become transgender? After all, that's what we non-trans people want to argue about, nature or nurture. But my daughter quickly put an end to all that by saying, does it matter?
Along with banning hospitals that participate in Medicare and Medicaid, from providing gender-affirming medical care to trans minors.
Minors, do we love minors? I love minors.
They also have targeted Medicaid dollars from being used in these procedures.
I'm not here to share my faith journey with you, and I'm certainly not here to tell you what your beliefs should be. I'll just say that it was because of my faith and my love for my child that I became a trans ally.
They are even threatening companies that make chest binders.
In 2024 alone, more than 650 bills were introduced in 43 states, and nearly 80 at the federal level, targeting trans people and seeking to block them from accessing health care, education, legal recognition, and even the right to publicly exist. More than 45 of those bills have passed into law, and 100 of them are still in process.
In the UK, there was an oversized role for a handful of women who were respected on the left, but turned out to be cultural reactionaries.
They're not just attacking trans people, they are narrowing the definition of womanhood to something small, fragile, easily controlled, and that hurts all of us.
They have now partnered with right-wing actors to create a controversy where there was none.
But let's look at the actual statistics on who poses the biggest threat to women's safety.
And managed to upend so much progress that had been made, demonizing trans people in ways that will take decades for society to recover from.
Whether you are cis or trans, the most common threat to your safety is the same: cisgender men. Cis men commit the overwhelming majority of violence against partners, strangers, co-workers, and friends.
In the US, it's more a case of a resurgence of weaponized homophobia from the 70s and 80s.
I saw my
and heard my parents talking about gay people, you know, warning me not to get into cars with strangers and why, and that homosexuals were older men that were around school in the bushes that, you know, waited for me to come out of the schoolyard and to lure me into the bushes. I mean, I was subject to the same stereotypes.
Politicians and religious figures have used the tried and tested tactic of framing any shift in gender roles and rights to be an attack on evangelical Christians or even society itself.
J.D. Vance has undergone a significant transformation in recent years, altering his views on racism, Donald Trump, and transgender rights.
Yet in both cases, we see the nationalization and abstraction of the issue as people pick a team that they're on and then respond reactively to the opposite side.
According to Sophia Nelson, a former classmate and close friend, Vance's earlier positions were notably different. At one point, Vance supported Nelson's transition and expressed criticism of the candidate he now supports.
Sometimes it's the case that there are clearly good guys and bad guys.
They shared a memory of Vance bringing them home-baked treats as a recovery gift shortly after their top surgery. Messages also show that Vance attended San Francisco Pride in 2015.
And this is one of them.
Vance and Nelson's friendship ended in 2021 after Vance supported a bill in Arizona banning gender-affirming care for youth.
So if you reactively oppose the people who are demonizing vulnerable groups, you have good odds of doing the right thing in terms of policy and voting.
Well, Nelson pointed out the robust medical consensus showing how this care saves lives. Vance dismissed them.
Yet this very dynamic can be used by bad faith actors to reinforce their propaganda and keep those they've brainwashed from ever rethinking what they've signed on to.
I'm a never Trump guy. I never liked him.
The more straight up adversarial the conversation becomes, the more entrenched people's views become as well.
Some of the comments coming out of that two-part article include these from the first female chief of staff, Susie Wiles, about the vice president of the United States, J.D. Vance, and his political shifts from a, quote, never Trumper to a MAGA acolyte. There's also something she says is sort of political.
But at the same time, we need to be aware of just how effective propaganda is over time.
My name is Jason Stanley. I'm the author of 5 books, most recently, How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them.
Millions of people in the UK who once supported human rights and respect for trans people have switched their views in the last decade.
Everyone uses propaganda. It's a kind of communication that makes a case for a goal bypassing reason.
Really in the last 5 years in response to this ongoing campaign.
We have these irrational biases, and what propaganda does is it takes notions like freedom, integrity, and it weds them to these irrational biases.
If you think such a campaign could never affect you, you might be right about this particular issue. But in my years of looking at how authoritarianism rose and how various groups have been targeted around the world in the last 130 years, I will tell you that given enough funding and given enough time, propaganda can completely remake society and draw support from groups and people who would previously have been completely opposed to the ideas under discussion.
Why was killing hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Iraqis called Operation Iraqi Freedom? Because the idea was somehow freedom is what Americans do. If we're doing it, it must be freedom.
The longer this attempt to use trans people as a way to terrorize and mobilize a political constituency continues, the more effective it will become. Even those very much opposed to it, after years of propaganda, will find their views shifting to accommodate the arguments and rhetoric of people in positions of power and those who get the most oxygen to disseminate their views. So how do we combat it then? In the information deserts of the U.S., it's very difficult right now. We are far enough along in the process, a lot of shifting has already happened. It's made worse by the fact that so many vital parts of the U.S. news landscape are now owned by or beholden to those aligned with the administration. Even the most powerful independent outlets have bought into the just asking questions model of reporting.
The New York Times to pipeline from literally from publication to being used in this litigation was 6 days in one case.
That fails to assess sources' knowledge and motivations while amplifying the views of those who wish to roll back others' rights to self-determination.
It was in early February, another horrific, just absolutely untrue at every turn, easily debunked, but like Pamela Paul op-ed came out, and within less than a week, it was cited, literally, in Idaho's briefing in this case.
It's important to understand that not all hope is lost, not by a long shot. This emphasis on anti-trans rhetoric has really not paid off in the elections, at least since last year in the presidential election.
Mr. Trump and Republican congressional candidates made rolling back federal protections for transgender people a big issue. By one count, they spent nearly $215 million on network TV ads on the issue, much of it focusing on gender-affirming care for minors.
It seems to be more and more of a losing issue.
In fact, an October survey of Virginia voters showed only 3% cited policies about transgender students as their top concern.
So there is absolutely room to step in and room to make a difference before these frameworks harden and take hold completely. And if you do want to be involved in how to address the rising wave of hate against trans folks, the answer in many cases is the same as how best to deal with hate against immigrants. Propaganda is strongest wherever a shouting match is most likely to break out, wherever people are most likely to be reminded of which team they're on.
You said that you're a trans woman.
A trans female, yes, sir.
Do you have a penis?
People's minds rarely get changed on social media.
That's horrible.
Yeah. You're the one that brought that into the discussion.
You're the one that never said anything about genitalia.
Oh, it had everything to do with genitalia.
I think this is why we see Sarah McBride, the first trans member elected to the House of Representatives, respond the way she does to these issues.
We are 2 legislative days away from the Affordable Care Act tax credits expiring, when millions of people will see their healthcare premiums skyrocket. And GOP leadership, with that deadline fast approaching, has decided to schedule 2 votes on anti-trans bills and precisely 0 votes on extending the Affordable Care Act tax credits.
People were angry in some cases at her that she has not been more combative over certain issues.
I now recognize the representative from Delaware, Mr. McBride.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
But I think she is most interested in sidestepping the kind of combat she sees as unproductive.
I get it's hard to understand what it feels like to be trans. I get that it is hard to understand what it feels like to be me.
Baited by her fellow representatives, she took away the bathroom issue entirely and suggested she was more interested in serving her voters.
I was a kid once. I didn't have the courage to come out until I was 21. But it's a fact I have known about myself for my entire life.
In her speech on the Capitol steps last week, she kept the conversation on a human level, talking about her own history as a trans person.
All any of us want is to live a life of purpose and happiness and wholeness. None of us know how long we have. None of us know how much time we have on this planet. It is already hard enough to raise a family. It is already hard enough to be a kid, and government should not make it harder.
It's an incredible challenge to try to undo political framing established by propaganda, and I think she's taking the approach of simply refusing to participate in the standard arguments in the standard ways because they're likely to be useless.
Sarah McBride was key to turning 4 Republicans against Marjorie Taylor Greene's transphobic bill. According to her colleague, Representative Becca Balint.
Which isn't to say you shouldn't express support for trans people on social media. You absolutely should. It can be a great place to help vulnerable people know that you have their back. And you absolutely should tell your elected representatives what you want them to support and give to national organizations protecting the legal rights of trans people and everyone else to live lives of hope and self-determination and freedom. And elected representatives and national organizations need to be looking at how to limit the influence the billionaire class has on our information sphere. But if you're concerned about that propaganda, remember that propaganda is weakest on the local level and in real lives. It is weakest where it comes to seeing effects on human beings. So support those doing reporting that actually covers the real lives and issues confronting trans folks. It's very hard simply even to do good reporting at this point, reporting that doesn't get swept into caricatures or horse races on who is winning the information wars. But it was great to see Hannah Seo's piece in Popular Science last week, where she just laid out the issues with trans folks, reporting data on a recent study showing that trans youth almost never detransition in the first several years after a social transition. She explains the study, shoots down popular misconceptions and deliberate distortions, includes the caveats about what we can't know from the study yet.
Lindsay Dawson is the director of LGBTQ health policy at KFF, which is an independent source of information on national health issues.
And lays out what kind of follow-up will be required to get answers.
If you really scour the evidence, you will find occasionally minors are accessing this type of care. This is rare, and it is in cases where minors are experiencing really prolonged gender dysphoria. And these conversations and decisions are made very carefully between minors, providers, and parents. It's not something that happens overnight. It's a careful and thoughtful, iterative type of care.
This kind of being able to simply see the issue at hand and report on it is the kind of thing that propaganda tends to destroy, and it can make a publication vulnerable when it does this honest reporting.
Why all this political attention to what sounds like a very small number?
It's a really small number of people, and even among that small group, smaller shares are accessing gender-affirming medical care.
Overhead narratives are a good way to understand the big picture, and they're a way to create meaning, but they're also the easiest place to tell lies and distort realities because they're removed from what's happening on the ground.
Trump's framing this as protecting women, as trying to help women. What do you make of that?
I mean, it really follows in the footsteps of many of the debates that we saw with reproductive care and is aimed at limiting access to services for a group of people based on sex and gender lines.
And once that overhead framework takes hold, no matter how dishonest it is, even if it's completely wrong, opposing it rarely works because even that opposition plays into the propaganda frame, giving more weight and attention to those who wish to do harm to vulnerable people.
What's the effect, or what do you think the effect is on transgender people, of all this, the discussion about it, the focus on it, and especially transgender adolescents?
There are trans youth who are denied access to medically necessary care that could prevent significant mental health problems, potentially even suicidality.
So you can also find out who is helping trans kids on the ground near you. See what kind of support is most useful for those groups. It might be galvanizing local officials to act to protect these kids. It might involve volunteering, or giving money for, or helping to organize community activities and resources that let them live more full lives and simultaneously normalize them in your community as fully human with equal rights to be present and public as anyone else.
My biggest regret in life is that I never had a childhood without that pain. I marvel at the courage of transgender young people today who are sharing themselves with their families and this world, despite the toxicity and the hate that too often emanates from the building behind me and from politicians within it.
The more present the protection and love is in everyday lives, the harder propaganda has to work to dismantle those community networks and attitudes. But the more you can speak about actual people on the ground and matters you've experienced directly, the less the larger argument over these issues will devolve into the equivalent of two kids arguing politics based on what their parents have told them.
Actor Pedro Pascal is looking back at calling author J.K. Rowling a heinous loser for her anti-trans views.
Shitpost if you want to.
Now, Pascal, in a Vanity Fair interview, said his comment growing into a larger story made him feel like that kid that got sent to the principal's office a lot for behavioral issues in public schools in Texas, feeling scared and thinking, what did I do?
It might actually build solidarity among those opposed to the current demonization of trans people.
The one thing that I would say I agonized over a little bit was just, am I helping? Am I helping? It's a situation that deserves the utmost elegance so that something can actually happen and people will actually be protected.
But if and when you want to dismantle the frameworks of propaganda, think about acting closer to home. And that's it for today. Here's to standing up together for what's right in more effective ways in 2026.
Thanks for listening to Next Comes What. Please share this with one person who's looking for ways to survive this mess. To support this podcast, please become a paid subscriber at AndreaPitzer.com and consider giving Next Comes What a 5-star review where you get your podcast.